Welcome to the deep dive. We're opening up a stack of material today that, honestly, it confronts this fundamental tension that almost every high-achieving person we know carries with them.
Mm,
If you're a leader, a builder, anyone focused on progress, you have this quiet assumption that, well, that momentum is good, and speed is even better. If
right.
acceleration signals competence in our careers, then it must signal competence in our spiritual formation, too.
Yeah.
That's the thinking.
But the sources you shared with us, they frame this completely differently, almost counterintuitively.
They really do. We're set up to admire quick success. But the mission for this deep dive is to analyze why something the sources call divine delay is, more often than not, an act of formative mercy.
Not postponement, not failure.
Exactly. We're just trained to believe that if something is taking a long time, we must be doing something wrong.
And what's fascinating is how the sources just buy it. They boil it down to one core conflict. They put it very simply. Speed is highly effective at producing outcomes, but only time, and usually slow time, can produce real depth. And that points to the central hazard for anyone who's driven, the danger of spiritual speed.
So what does that actually look like in practice?
It's moving faster than you're being formed. It's when you accelerate beyond your actual, your interior capacity.
So you arrive at a place that looks impressive,
Hmm.
a big platform, a new opportunity.
A place that looks impressive, exactly. But you get there completely unprepared. The depth you need to actually sustain that success, it just isn't there yet.
That immediately raises the stakes, especially for anyone listening who feels called to something, who's been entrusted with responsibility.
It does.
The risk isn't just missing the next big thing, it's moving forward without the internal structure you need to support the external growth.
That's the key distinction. God's slowness, as the sources put it, isn't from a lack of power or resources. It's an expression of wisdom.
Protecting us.
He's protecting us from arriving unformed at a destination that demands depth, resilience, and character we just don't possess yet.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. The cultural pathology around speed, because everything in our world reinforces this hurry.
Everything.
The sources note how, visibility gets rewarded so much faster than faithfulness. You get the metrics before you have the maturity.
Platforms can scale literally overnight. A soul cannot. A soul has to be anchored, and that takes time.
And this rapid acceleration, it creates a pretty profound spiritual distortion. The sources pose this. It's a truly unsettling question for us to think about.
It is.
What if the greatest long-term threat to your calling isn't some big, obvious act of disobedience, but rather impatience dressed up as faith?
That phrase is powerful, because that's exactly what we do.
When we interpret waiting as resistance, or, proof that we're failing, we instinctively fill that gap with our own striving.
If God isn't moving fast enough, we decide we have to move for him.
We launch before we've listened. We build the platform before our character has the weight to hold it steady.
And the cost of that self-propelled acceleration, it's systemic, it's predictable. We're not talking about random mishaps.
Right.
We're talking about the inevitable consequences of bypassing formation.
Yeah.
Burnout, moral failure, deep disillusionment, a spiritual shallowness that it reveals itself the moment pressure is applied.
These are the direct outcomes of skipping the quiet, slow inner work.
They are.
So if we look at this structurally,
Right.
what exactly are the gaps, right? What happens when we move too quickly?
Right, and the sources they're meticulously clear about this. Spiritual speed creates these imbalances that they undermine the whole structure of a person.
A mismatch.
A huge mismatch. You end up with a situation where, authority just completely outstrips wisdom.
Visibility exceeds integrity.
And opportunity far exceeds your actual capacity.
I can see that play out constantly in professional settings.
Yeah.
You hire the charismatic, gifted leader who has immense talent. The doors just fly open for them. But 6 months later, the whole system fractures because their inner architecture, the quiet work of humility, of patience, it doesn't match the public platform.
That's it, exactly. The talent opens the door, but it's the character that sustains the tenure. And the most painful takeaway here is that what you bypass in the early stages,
The internal lessons, the humility.
all of it, it's rarely avoided forever. It is simply postponed, usually until a collapse makes that lesson totally unavoidable. You pay the price for speed eventually.
And usually when the stakes are highest.
Always when the stakes are
Yeah,
highest.
a harsh, but I think a necessary reality check. So if the modern path of speed and striving leads to this predictable collapse, where's the alternative?
Well, this is where the sources turn to these historical and biblical patterns. and they offer a completely different metric for success.
It's a pattern you see repeated constantly, this idea that God deliberately refuses to move at the pace of human readiness.
It's not a failure to act on his part. It's a deep commitment to formation. The foundational example is Israel. They're standing right at the border of the Promised Land, fresh from this miraculous deliverance, and they are absolutely convinced they are ready.
And what should have been, a few weeks' journey?
Yeah.
A short sprint. It becomes 40 years of wandering in the wilderness.
40 years.
We often read that as just divine punishment for a specific failure. But the sources reframe it completely.
They argue the delays were actually profound acts of mercy. They were designed to prevent a collapse in the future.
So what was the why behind that?
The why is essential. If God had just rushed them into the Promised Land, they would have imploded. A people liberated physically too quickly, they still carried the slavery inside them.
The impatience, the entitlement.
The lack of dependence.
Yeah.
Exactly. God's delay was shaping their capacity. It was humbling them. The wilderness was training them in this slow, daily dependence, making sure their formation finally caught up with their calling.
And this pattern, it's not just for a nation. If we look at the bigger picture, we see this theme of formation before fulfillment in so many key figures.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about Moses. He was passionate, he was convinced of his purpose, but he acted on just pure, impulsive zeal.
When he killed the Egyptian.
Yes. He assumed his conviction meant divine authorization. And that one impulsive act led to a devastating, silent 40 years of obscurity in Midian.
40 years. So that delay, it wasn't a detour. It was the preparation itself.
It had to be.
What did being a humble shepherd in a desert achieve that being a prince in Egypt just couldn't?
It taught him to listen. I mean, that's the bottom line. It broke his reliance on his own strength, his own ambition. It replaced the arrogance of the palace with the quiet patience you need to shepherd difficult people.
So the world lost a brilliant prince.
But God gained a humble servant who was ready to actually hear the whisper from a burning bush.
But in David, he's on the same trajectory. Anointed king is a young shepherd boy. The promise is sealed. But then he spends years fleeing Saul.
Hiding in caves, enduring betrayal. He was already king in principle, so you have to ask why the delay.
The delay was protective.
It had to be. It was forming restraint, political wisdom, mercy, all before the crown actually rested on his head. Imagine if he'd taken the throne right after being anointed.
He would have been an impulsive, zealous kid, probably just as prone to tyranny as Saul was.
Right. The caves formed his character. They taught him self-control and loyalty to God, which is what ultimately secured his kingdom.
And maybe the most powerful example of all is Jesus himself. Even the sinless Son of God submitted to 30 hidden years.
30 years in Nazareth before any public ministry. His pace wasn't dictated by the urgency of the world around him.
No, it was governed by discernment, by obedience to the Father's timing, resisting that temptation for premature acclaim.
And that's the ultimate counter-narrative to our culture of hurry. It synthesizes this whole principle for you, the listener. Calling without formation becomes dangerous.
God is preparing people, not just outcomes.
That's it. He is fundamentally committed to preparing people. Their character, their depth, their interior life, not just producing impressive, but ultimately unsustainable results.
This really shifts our whole concept of waiting, doesn't it? We usually see it as passive, as wasted time.
Far from it. The material draws on this Hebrew concept of waiting, kava. It's an active posture. It carries the sense of being bound together, like your hope is intertwined with your patience.
So to wait on the Lord isn't just pausing your life.
No, it's actively aligning your entire life, your whole agenda, with God's timing.
When you put hurry and hearing next to each other, the differences are stark. Hurry just amplifies all that internal noise, anxiety, ambition, self-doubt.
And that makes it almost impossible to hear God's voice, which so often comes in that, that gentle whisper like Elijah experienced.
Exactly. So embracing God's slower, more intentional pace, it must require some specific practices.
It does. The sources suggest that margin, for instance, isn't some weekend indulgence. It's an act of obedience. It's an essential container for God's formative work in your life.
Okay, I understand the importance of margin, but for someone listening who's facing real deadlines, 24/7 connectivity, how do you distinguish between divine delay and just, old-fashioned procrastination?
That is a critical question, and the distinction really comes down to intentionality. Procrastination is driven by avoidance or laziness. Slowness is driven by purpose and formation.
And the practical strategies in the sources are meant to create structure around that intentionality.
They are. The first one is understanding Sabbath as resistance.
Resistance, I like
The
that.
Sabbath is fundamentally countercultural. It interrupts the tyranny of endless productivity. It's an obedient recalibration that declares your life's value must honor God's rhythm, not the endless demands of performance.
It's resisting that impulse that says, I am what I produce.
That's the one. And this reframes rest as a necessary context for your formation, not just a luxury or a reward.
Okay, so what about self-assessment tools? How do we identify where we might be rushing ahead?
There's a powerful tool they call the waiting inventory. It requires you to sit with some very intentional, probing questions.
Such as?
For example, what specific thing am I currently pushing God to accomplish on my timetable? And then, maybe more importantly, what kind of person might he be forming in me while I wait, even though I see no outward change?
Asking those questions immediately shines a light on all those hidden agendas and misplaced pressures.
It really does. And the second core discipline is silence and solitude. Creating intentional quiet protects your soul from all the external demands, emails, notifications, the news, and the internal ones too.
The voice of anxiety or ambition.
All of it. It trains the soul to discern God's voice rather than just reacting impulsively to pressure.
We mentioned earlier there was a real-world case study in the sources, right? A ministry launch that was delayed.
Yes, and that case study really serves as proof of concept. The pressure on them to launch immediately was immense, but the leadership team intentionally chose a slower, more deliberate path.
And that delay.
It protected their integrity. It allowed the organizational structure to solidify slowly, which in the end secured much greater, much more lasting fruitfulness. The insight holds true, whether you're in ministry or business. Growth that lasts is, almost without exception, slow.
So if we step back now, the ultimate insight from this deep dive is pretty clear. God's slowness isn't inefficiency. It is profound wisdom. It's extraordinary care.
He moves at the pace of love, not at the pace of ambition or some corporate urgency.
And that means the invitation for you, listening, is not to stop moving forward, but to move faithfully at God's pace, resisting that cultural pressure to just hurry.
The soul that takes the time to wait and listen will not be left behind. It will be prepared.
And that preparation, that's the foundation for any lasting impact you want to have. It's about making sure your zeal and passion are actually matched by a sustainable character. Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to consider based on everything we've covered today.
If you track your life and you consistently find that God moves slower than your immediate ambitions, what might that persistent pattern reveal? Not about his willingness to bless you, but about the specific resilience, the humility, and the wisdom that he insists must quietly take shape beneath the surface. Because that slow, unhurried interior work, well, that's the true foundation for everything that lasts.